Guys, the ending of this story will surprise you, so I advise you to watch to the end. Part 1, The Setup. The old Carver house had stood on the edge of town for as long as anyone could remember, shrouded in stories whispered at sleepovers and around campfires. Locals said it was cursed, that the family who once lived there had vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but crumbling walls and a lingering sense of dread. Of course, none of that mattered to a group of teenagers looking for a place to party. It was Bryce's idea to hold his 18th birthday there. He was always the fearless one, the ringleader. It'll be legendary, he had grinned as the others hesitated. No parents, no neighbors, no limits. Just us and the house. Come on, what's the worst that could happen? The worst was a loaded question, but no one wanted to be the killjoy. So, on a biting night in December, they trudged through ankle-deep snow, flashlights in hand, toward the sagging two-story house. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood and rot. It wasn't snowing, but the overcast sky blotted out the moonlight, leaving everything cloaked in darkness. Man, this place is worse than I thought, muttered Caleb, pulling his hoodie tighter around his frame as the group approached the house. His breath fogged in the icy air. You sure we won't get arrested for trespassing? Who's gonna catch us? Bryce shot back, grinning as he hoisted a backpack filled with snacks, drinks, and the cheap speaker they planned to use for music. It's just an old house. No one's lived here for, 50 years. Yeah, for a reason, muttered Sierra, shivering as she followed. She didn't want to admit it, but the sight of the house made her stomach churn. The windows were dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets, and the front door hung crookedly on its hinges. She thought she saw something move in one of the upstairs windows but told herself it was just her nerves. The group, 6 of them in total, made their way inside. Bryce, Caleb, Sierra, Emily, and the twins, Max and Madison. The floor creaked beneath their feet, and a musty chill wrapped around them like a second skin. Dust motes floated in the beam of their flashlights, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. All right, Bryce said, clapping his hands together to shake off the eerie quiet. Let's set up in the living room. It's got the most space, and the fireplace makes it almost cozy. Almost, Emily muttered under her breath. She wasn't thrilled about spending the night in a house that looked like it could collapse at any moment, but she'd come along for the sake of the group. For Bryce, mostly. As they unpacked their things, Caleb wandered toward a staircase that led to the second floor. The banister was splintered, and a thick layer of dust covered each step. His flashlight revealed peeling wallpaper and doors that stood slightly ajar, their dark interiors like open mouths. Hey, he called out, his voice echoing faintly. What do you think happened to the people who used to live here? Ghosts got Max teased, shaking the snow off his boots. Probably wandered into the woods and froze to death. Or maybe they went full psycho and killed each other. You know, like a murder-suicide thing. Not helping, Sierra snapped, her nerves already frayed. She glanced around the room uneasily. It felt too quiet, as if the house were holding its breath. The hours dragged on, the group doing their best to shake off the ominous vibes. Music played from Bryce's speaker, the volume barely enough to mask the creaks and groans of the house. They joked, ate snacks, and tried to forget where they were. But the unease crept back in as the wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Emily swore she heard footsteps upstairs, but when Bryce went to check, he found nothing but an empty hallway. See, he said when he came back down. It's just an old house. They make noises. Relax. Sierra wasn't convinced. She had her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the darkened corners of the room. This place feels wrong, she murmured. It's fine, Bryce said, rolling his eyes. You're just psyching yourself out. But Sierra wasn't the only one who felt it. Even Caleb, who prided himself on being logical, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. At exactly midnight, everything changed. Their phones buzzed simultaneously, the vibration cutting through the uneasy quiet. Everyone froze, exchanging wary glances before pulling out their devices. "What the hell?" Max said, his voice unsteady. Each screen displayed the same message. Just 3 words, glowing against the darkness. "We see you." Part 2, the message. For a moment, no one moved. The glow from their phones cast eerie shadows on their faces as they stared at the identical message. "We see you." Sierra was the first to break the silence. "Okay, what the hell is this? Is someone messing with us?" Bryce forced a laugh, though it came out shakier than he intended. "Probably just some spam or something. You know how scammers are these days." "Spam?" Madison snapped, holding up her phone. Her face was pale, her usual bravado cracked. "We all got the same message at the same time, that's not spam." Caleb frowned, scrolling through his phone. "It doesn't show a sender. Just, nothing. No number, no username. How is that even possible?" Sierra stood up, her breathing quick and shallow. "I'm leaving. I don't care if it's a prank or whatever. This place, this night, none of it feels right." Bryce stepped in front of her, hands raised in a placating gesture. Whoa. Chill, okay? It's just a stupid text. Someone's trying to scare us, and it's working. But we're not gonna let them win, right?" "Who?" Emily's voice was tight. "Who would even know we're here? We didn't tell anyone." Bryce faltered, glancing at the others. "I don't know. Maybe someone saw us on the way in, or maybe it's GPS stuff. Phones are weird." "Phones are weird," Max mimicked, his usual sarcasm taking on an edge of fear. "Great explanation, Sherlock. Super convincing." Another notification buzzed, and the group flinched as one. Sierra let out a small yelp, clutching her phone as if it might bite her. Bryce glanced at his screen. "It's a picture." His voice dropped. The others quickly checked their own devices. Sure enough, each of them had received the same photo. It showed the 6 of them sitting in the living room, just moments earlier. Bryce laughing. Emily brushing her hair back. Sierra hugging her knees. The twins sharing a look. "Who took this?" Madison whispered, her voice trembling. "No one," Bryce said firmly, though his own face betrayed doubt. "It's gotta be fake. Maybe it's one of those AI things." "AI doesn't sneak into a house and take pictures of you," Emily shot back. "Then how?" Bryce began, but Caleb cut him off. "Look at the angle," Caleb said, holding his phone closer to his face. "It's from up high. Like, from the ceiling." The room went silent as all 6 of them instinctively looked up. The beam of Bryce's flashlight followed their gazes. The ceiling was plain and cracked, the yellowed plaster broken in places. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. "See?" Bryce said quickly, though his voice wavered. "There's nothing there." "But there was," Sierra said softly. She turned toward the door. "I don't care what you say, Bryce. I'm not staying here another second." She moved to grab her coat, but the front door, which had been sagging slightly open when they arrived, was now shut tight. Sierra yanked on the knob, but it didn't budge. "Seriously?" she muttered, putting her weight into it. "It's stuck." Bryce joined her, pulling hard, but the door didn't move. It felt like it had been welded shut. "Okay, not funny," Max said, pacing. "This is not funny." "It's probably the cold," Caleb offered, though his tone was unconvincing. "Wood swells in the winter. Maybe it's just jammed." "What about the windows?" Emily suggested, already heading toward one. She pulled back the moth-eaten curtain and tried to lift the pane. It didn't budge. She tried another window, then another. All of them were sealed shut, the frames locked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. "This isn't happening," Madison muttered. She dug into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. "I'm calling someone. The cops, my parents, I don't care." "No signal," she said, staring at the screen. "How can there be no signal? We're not even that far from town." Caleb checked his phone. "No bars here either." "Someone needs to stay calm," Bryce said, though the tremor in his voice made it clear he wasn't feeling calm himself. "There's gotta be an explanation for all this." "Yeah." Sierra snapped, her voice rising. "Explain this." She shoved her phone into Bryce's hands. Another picture. This one showed them again, but now, everyone was standing, their faces twisted in fear as they looked up at the ceiling. The exact moment from just a minute ago. "That's not possible," Caleb whispered. "That's not." Before he could finish, the lights flickered. The dim overhead bulb, which had barely been providing light, blinked twice and then went out completely. They were plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of their phone screens. A scraping sound echoed through the house, low and deliberate. It started from somewhere upstairs and moved slowly toward the staircase. "Tell me you heard that," Emily whispered, clutching Caleb's arm. "I heard it," Caleb replied, barely able to breathe. The scraping stopped abruptly. Bryce raised his flashlight, aiming it at the base of the stairs. The beam shook as his hand trembled. "Hello?" he called, his voice cracking. "Who's there?" For a long moment, there was no response. Then came a soft, deliberate creak, as if someone, or something, was stepping onto the first stair. Part 3, Isolation and Fear. The creak of the stair echoed through the house, a sound that seemed to vibrate in their bones. Bryce kept the flashlight trained on the staircase, but the beam revealed nothing except splintered wood and peeling wallpaper. "Who's there?" Bryce called again, his voice thin and strained. No answer. Another creak followed, louder this time, like the deliberate weight of a foot pressing down. It was coming closer. I am not staying here," Sierra stammered, backing away toward the kitchen door. "You can all stay and figure out your little ghost hunt, but I'm leaving." "Sierra, wait," Caleb started, but she didn't stop. The others watched as she disappeared into the shadows of the kitchen, her flashlight bouncing erratically. Bryce swallowed hard and squared his shoulders. "We have to stick together. Nobody else leaves the room, okay?" "Too late," Emily whispered, nodding toward Sierra's direction. "What if something?" Before she could finish, the lights flickered back on with an electric snap, flooding the room in dim, yellowish light. Bryce whipped around toward the staircase, but it was empty. "See," he said, trying to sound confident. "The house is just old. It's creaking and settling, and we're all freaking out over nothing." "Then what about the texts?" Madison asked, her voice trembling. "The pictures?" "Bryce, this isn't just nothing. Let's just find Sierra," Caleb interjected, his voice tense. "We can't let her wander off alone in this place." The group hesitated before reluctantly following Caleb into the kitchen. The smell of mildew was stronger here, and the room felt even colder than the rest of the house. Their flashlights swept over grimy countertops and rusted appliances. "Sierra?" Caleb called, stepping cautiously forward. "Are you okay?" The faint beam of his flashlight caught movement near the back door. Sierra was standing there, facing away from them. Her head was tilted slightly to the side, as if she were listening to something. "Sierra?" Emily called softly. No response. Bryce stepped closer, his voice firmer now. "Hey, Sierra. Are you?" Before he could finish, Sierra turned to face them, and all six of them froze. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her lips moved silently, forming words they couldn't hear. She was clutching her phone in one hand, the screen glowing faintly. "Are you okay?" Caleb asked, his voice breaking the silence. Sierra blinked slowly, as if coming out of a trance. She glanced down at her phone, then up at the group. It sent me another message," she whispered. "What message?" Madison asked, her voice barely audible. Sierra held up her phone. The screen displayed a single word. "Basement." A shiver ran through the group. Bryce stepped back, shaking his head. "No. Absolutely not. We're not splitting up again, and we're definitely not going into the basement. But what if we have to?" Sierra said quietly, her voice trembling. "What if, whatever this is won't let us leave until we do?" "Are you serious?" Max snapped. "You think we're gonna follow some creepy ghost text into a murder dungeon? Hell no." As if on cue, the lights flickered violently, plunging the kitchen into darkness again. This time, the scraping sound returned, louder and more frantic. It was no longer coming from the stairs, it was coming from below. "I'm not staying here," Madison cried, clutching Max's arm. "None of us are staying here," Bryce barked, turning toward the front of the house. "We're getting out of this damn house, one way or another." The group rushed back to the living room, their flashlights dancing wildly across the walls. Bryce reached the front door first and yanked at the knob with all his strength. It didn't budge. He threw his weight against it, gritting his teeth, but it might as well have been cemented shut. "Move!" Caleb shouted, shoving past Bryce. He grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at one of the windows with all his might. The chair splintered on impact, but the glass didn't even crack. "It's not glass," Caleb muttered, staring at the window in disbelief. "It's something else." "What do you mean, something else?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. "I don't know." Caleb snapped. "It's like it's not real." The scraping sound grew louder, now accompanied by faint, rhythmic thumps. It echoed through the house, as if something were crawling up from the depths. "Basement," Sierra whispered, clutching her phone tightly. "It's coming from the basement." "No," Bryce said firmly. "We're not going down there. We'll figure another way out." "Then what's your plan, huh?" Sierra shot back, her voice rising. "Because we're trapped. You think we can just sit here and wait for it to go away?" "She's right," Caleb said reluctantly, his face pale. "If this thing, whatever it is, wants us in the basement, then maybe that's the only way to end this." Bryce stared at him, his jaw clenched. "You don't know that. For all we know, it's a trap. Do you have a better idea?" Caleb challenged. Before Bryce could answer, their phones buzzed again. The vibrations sent a collective chill through the group. Slowly, one by one, they looked down at their screens. The message was simple. "Come now, or one of you stays forever." "What does that mean?" Emily whispered, tears streaming down her face. "What does that mean?" No one answered. The thumping and scraping from below grew louder, more insistent. Whatever was in the basement wanted them to come, and it was no longer asking. Part 4, The Unseen Stalker. No one moved. The words on their screens seemed to burn into their minds. "Come now, or one of you stays forever." The scraping noise from the basement had become relentless, almost angry. It clawed at their nerves, each sound sharper than the last. Bryce was the first to break the silence. "All right, fine," he said, his voice tight. "We'll go. We'll check out the basement. But we stick together, no wandering off, no trying to be the hero." "This is insane," Max muttered, his face pale. "We don't even know what's down there." "Exactly," Caleb said grimly, gripping his flashlight. "And we won't find out by staying up here. You saw what happened to the door, to the windows. We're not leaving until whatever this is lets us. The group exchanged fearful glances, and then, reluctantly, they began moving toward the basement door. It was an old wooden thing with rusted hinges and a tarnished brass knob. Bryce reached it first, swallowing hard before turning the handle. It opened with a groan, revealing a dark staircase descending into the void. The air that wafted up was frigid, colder than the already icy house. It smelled of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like pennies left out in the rain. "Who's going first?" Madison asked, clutching Max's arms so tightly he winced. Bryce gritted his teeth. "I'll go. Just, stay close." He took the first step down, his flashlight illuminating the narrow, splintered stairs. Each step creaked ominously under his weight. The others followed in single file, their flashlights slicing through the oppressive darkness. The basement was larger than they expected, with low ceilings and dirt floors. Old shelves lined the walls, their contents hidden under dusty tarps. Rusted tools and shattered glass littered the ground, as though whoever had lived there left in a hurry. But it was the far corner of the basement that caught their attention. There was a figure standing there, motionless, its silhouette faintly illuminated by the pale beams of their flashlights. Who is that?" Emily whispered, gripping Caleb's arm. No one answered. The figure didn't move. It was tall and unnaturally still, as if carved from stone. "Hello?" Bryce called, his voice cracking. "Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. Bryce took a cautious step closer, but as the flashlight beam landed on it, he froze. It wasn't a person. It was a mannequin, an old one, with cracked plaster skin and empty black sockets where the eyes should have been. Its mouth was slightly open, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "What the hell?" Max muttered, exhaling shakily. "Why is that even down here?" As if in response, the scraping sound returned, louder than ever. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, surrounding them. "That's it," Madison said, her voice panicked. "We're leaving. I don't care what it says. We're going now." But when she turned toward the staircase, her flashlight flickered and went out. One by one, the others' flashlights sputtered before plunging them into darkness. "Stay together," Bryce shouted, his voice rising over the sound of shuffling feet and panicked breathing. Something moved in the darkness, brushing past Emily. She screamed, grabbing for Caleb. "Something touched me. It's just the air," Bryce yelled, though he sounded unsure. "It's just..." A low, guttural growl cut him off. It didn't sound human. It came from the direction of the mannequin. Nope, Max stammered, pulling Madison close as they backed away. The lights from their phones flickered back on, casting a dim, uneven glow over the basement. The mannequin was gone. "It was right there," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "It was right there." "Look," Caleb said, pointing. His hand shook as he directed their attention to the dirt floor where the mannequin had stood. There were footprints, bare, human-like, but elongated, with clawed toes. "What is this?" Bryce demanded, his voice sharp with fear. "What is happening?" Before anyone could respond, their phones buzzed again. The group flinched, fumbling to check their screens. This time, the message was different. "One of you will not leave this house." The temperature in the basement seemed to plummet. Emily's teeth chattered as she clutched Caleb's arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." "And go where?" Max shot back. "The house won't let us leave. Don't you get that?" "Shut up," Bryce barked. "Everyone just, shut up. We'll figure this out." As they argued, the growling noise returned, now accompanied by slow, deliberate footsteps. The sound echoed off the walls, coming closer. Bryce spun around, his phone's flashlight trembling as he pointed it toward the source. The beam landed on the far wall, where a jagged crack had formed in the concrete. Something was emerging, a hand, long and thin, its fingers ending in sharp, bone-like points. "Run," Caleb whispered. Then louder, "Run." The group bolted for the stairs, shoving and tripping over one another in their panic. Bryce reached the staircase first, practically leaping up the steps. Caleb was right behind him, dragging Emily along as she sobbed. "Move, move, move," Bryce shouted, reaching for the basement door. He slammed it shut just as the growling erupted into a furious roar. The door shuddered violently as something heavy slammed against it from the other side. "Hold it!" Caleb yelled, throwing his weight against the door. Bryce braced himself beside him, their combined strength barely keeping it closed. "What do we do?" Emily cried, clutching her phone. "What do we do?" Another buzz. Another message. This one chilled them more than the growling ever could. Decide who stays. Part 5, The Confrontation. Bryce and Caleb pushed against the basement door with all their strength, the thudding and growling on the other side relentless. The house seemed alive now, groaning, shuddering, its walls vibrating with some unseen force. Decide who stays. Emily whispered, staring at her phone's screen. Her voice cracked, and tears streamed down her face. What does that even mean? How can we? It's not real. Bryce snapped, as much to convince himself as anyone else. His knuckles were white as he braced against the door. This is just some messed up prank, or. Then what's slamming on the door? Madison demanded, standing with Max at the far end of the living room. Her voice was shrill, her eyes darting to the walls and shadows as if expecting something to lunge out. What is that thing, Bryce? You can't explain this away anymore. The basement door shuddered again, the frame cracking under the force of whatever was trying to break through. Bryce looked at Caleb, desperation flickering in his eyes. We can't hold this much longer, Caleb said through gritted teeth. We need to move. To where? Max said bitterly, pacing in circles. We've been over this. We can't leave, we can't call for help, we can't. Stop yelling. Sierra screamed. She sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, rocking slightly. Just stop yelling, it's listening. Her words silenced the group. Even Max froze, his breathing ragged. It doesn't want all of us, Sierra whispered, staring at the floor. It said one of us has to stay. No, Emily said sharply. No one is staying behind. We'll figure something out. I don't know, we'll smash through the windows, break down the door. And what if it lets us leave? Madison cut in, her voice rising. What if it only lets us leave after we do what it wants? What if we're stuck here forever unless we? No. Emily shouted, her hands trembling. We are not doing this. I don't care what it says. Bryce stood upright, his back against the door. Everyone just calm down, he said, though his voice was tight. We're not leaving anyone. We just need to think. His phone buzzed. They all flinched, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. Bryce didn't want to look, but his hand moved on its own, lifting the screen to his face. Another message. Decide now. Or we will. Oh my God, Madison whispered, her phone lighting up with the same words. It's serious. It's really serious. Emily clutched Caleb's arm, her nails digging into his skin. What does that mean? What will it do? Before anyone could answer, the pounding at the basement door stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. The group stood frozen, their shallow breathing the only sound in the room. Then came the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, impossibly heavy. They echoed from deeper in the house now, moving away from the basement and toward the front hallway. It's coming, Caleb whispered. It's upstairs. We have to do something, Bryce said. He moved toward the center of the group, his voice firm despite the panic in his eyes. We're not waiting around to see what it does. We'll go for the windows again. Maybe together we can. The lights flickered violently, and a deafening bang shook the house. The group screamed as every phone screen lit up at once, their buzzes overlapping into a sickening cacophony. Each phone displayed a new message. We chose. What does that mean? Emily sobbed. What does that? A blood-curdling scream erupted from behind them. The group spun around to see Sierra, her back arched, her eyes wide with terror. Her phone clattered to the floor as she clawed at her throat, gasping for air. Sierra! Caleb yelled, rushing to her. He grabbed her shoulders, but she jerked violently, her limbs convulsing as if an invisible force had taken hold of her. Bryce and Emily tried to help, but she suddenly went still. Sierra's head snapped to the side, and her glassy eyes stared at the far corner of the room. A shadow moved there, darker than the dim light should allow. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs elongated like twisted branches. The group froze, watching in horror as the shadow slowly stepped forward, dragging Sierra's limp body toward the wall. No! Stop! Madison screamed, rushing forward, but Bryce held her back. There's nothing we can do, he yelled, his voice breaking. The shadow reached the far wall, and without a sound, both it and Sierra vanished into the darkness. Where did she go? Emily sobbed, falling to her knees. Where is she? Gone, Caleb whispered, his face pale and hollow. It took her. The silence returned, thick and suffocating. The group huddled together, trembling, unable to look at the spot where Sierra had disappeared. Their phones buzzed again. No one wanted to look, but the notifications demanded attention. With trembling hands, Bryce checked his screen. This time, the message was simple. Satisfied. Does that mean we can leave? Max asked, his voice barely audible. Bryce turned toward the front door. He stepped forward hesitantly and grabbed the knob. It turned easily in his hand. It's unlocked, he whispered. We can go. Then let's go. Madison cried, rushing to the door. They didn't need to be told twice. One by one, they bolted out of the house and into the snow-covered yard, the cold night air stinging their skin. No one spoke as they ran, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. When they finally reached the edge of the property, Bryce stopped and turned back. The house loomed in the darkness, silent and still. What are you doing? Caleb demanded, grabbing his arm. Let's go. Bryce shook his head slowly. What if it's not over? The others followed his gaze, staring at the house as if expecting it to lunge after them. But nothing moved. The house was just a house again, silent, empty, and waiting. Part 6, The Final Blow. The group didn't stop running until they were far from the Carver house, their lungs burning and their legs trembling from exertion. The snow crunched beneath their feet, the sound deafening in the cold, empty night. No one spoke. No one looked back. They just ran. When they finally reached the edge of the woods that bordered the abandoned property, Bryce doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping for air. Emily collapsed onto a nearby log, tears streaming down her face. Caleb, Max, and Madison leaned against a tree, their eyes darting toward the direction they had come from. The house was no longer in sight, but its presence still lingered like a shadow over them. She's gone, Emily choked out, breaking the silence. Her voice cracked as she buried her face in her hands. Sierra's, she's gone. No one responded. The truth was unbearable, yet undeniable. The memory of Sierra's scream, the way she had been pulled into the shadow, replayed in their minds on a torturous loop. What the hell was that thing? Madison finally whispered. Her voice was hoarse, her hands trembling as she clung to her twin. How did it take her? We shouldn't have gone there, Caleb said, his voice hollow. We shouldn't have stayed. Bryce straightened up, his face pale and tight with guilt. I'm sorry, he said quietly. It was my idea. I thought it would just be fun, just a stupid, scary birthday party. I didn't know, he trailed off, unable to find the words. Max shook his head, his jaw clenched. It doesn't matter whose idea it was. That house, it's evil. That thing, it wasn't just some ghost story. It was real. But why Sierra? Emily asked, her voice rising with desperation. Why did it take her? Caleb hesitated, then shook his head. It didn't want her. It wanted one of us. It made us choose, and we didn't, so it chose for us. That's insane, Madison muttered. It's all insane. It let us go, Bryce said quietly. He glanced at the others, his expression haunted. But what if it didn't really let us go? What if? What if it's not over? The group fell silent, the question lingering in the freezing air. The sound of the wind howling through the trees sent a chill down their spines. Let's just get out of here, Caleb said finally. Far away from this place. We'll tell someone, anyone. They have to do something about that house. Max snorted bitterly. Yeah. And what do we tell them? That a ghost sent us texts and stole our friend? They'll think we're crazy. Does it matter? Emily snapped, standing abruptly. I don't care if they believe us. Someone has to know what's in there. What if someone else goes into that house? No one argued. As they trudged through the snow, their breaths forming uneven clouds in the air, the weight of what they had left behind pressed heavily on them. They made it back to town just before dawn. The streets were silent, the houses dark, but the familiarity of civilization brought no comfort. They stopped at a diner that had just opened, its fluorescent lights harsh against the nightmarish haze clinging to their minds. The waitress didn't ask why they looked so disheveled, why their faces were pale and drawn, why Emily was still silently crying. She simply poured their coffee and left them alone. Bryce stared at his phone on the table, his hands wrapped tightly around the mug of coffee. I'm deleting the messages, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Good idea, Caleb muttered, pulling out his own phone. I don't want any part of this left behind. The others followed suit, deleting the texts and pictures, erasing the memory from their devices. It felt futile, like scrubbing blood from their hands that would never truly come clean. Do you think that's it? Emily asked after a long silence. That it's over? Bryce hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. He deleted the final message, ***, decide who stays, and locked his phone. Yeah, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. I think it's over. A week later. Madison sat in her bedroom, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. She hadn't slept much since that night. None of them had. She kept the lights on when she went to bed, and every creak or groan of the house made her heart race. Her parents noticed something was wrong, but she didn't know how to explain it to them. Her phone buzzed, breaking her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. One new message. Her heart sank, her stomach flipping as she opened it. It was from an unknown sender. We're still watching. Madison's breath caught in her throat as another buzz followed. This time, it was a picture. She stared in horror as it loaded on the screen. It was a photo of her, sitting in her bedroom, taken from somewhere behind her. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows. The room was empty. But when she looked back at her phone, the camera app was open. The screen reflected her terrified face, and the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner of the room, just behind her.